glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you're in my life. I'm so glad you came to save us. You came from heaven to earth to show the way. From the earth to the cross, my debt to pay. From the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. You came from heaven to earth to show the way. From the earth to the cross, my debt to pay. From the cross to the grave, from the grave to the sky. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Lord, I lift your name on high. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. Early in the morning our song shall rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God over all and bless eternally. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee, casting down their golden crowns among the crystal sea. Cherubim and seraphim falling down before thee, who was and art and evermore shalt be. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. All thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God over all and bless eternally. There is beyond the azure blue a God concealed from human sight. He tinted skies with heavenly hue and framed the worlds with his great might. There is a God. There is a God. He is alive. He is alive. In him we live, and we survive. And we survive from dust our God. Created man. He is a God. The great I am. The great I am. There was a long, long time ago.
This, so I don't feel like I'm having to lean as far forward to be heard. Let people get a little bit more settled, but this is our last class period together. So whether or not we finish the discussion, we will be finished with the discussion. So still feel free to, if you have comments, that's what usually makes these go better. And with what I have left, if there are no comments, we may be out of here in the next 10, 15 minutes. So a few things I wanted to start with this week based on, one, some discussion that was had and some comments that were also had during class was, for those who are visiting with us, we are talking about an overall topic of God's design for various things in our lives, with an emphasis at this point on marriage. When we talk about design, remember that this is the ideal situation for which we as Christians are striving. As you're having conversations with those out in the world, understand that this may not be reflective of their relationships, and working to have that understanding so that we can all strive for the godly design in our lives. And when we talk about it here, I think it's important for us to be as strict as possible on ourselves, because it's important that we hold ourselves to account, that we don't give ourselves any excuses, but to always be gentle when we're having conversations with people, to speak the truth and to do so in a loving way so that we can better help them get to where they need to be. A couple of things from comments that I want to pull out as we start today, because we talked about husbands loving your wives. We talked about wives loving your husbands, because there's that crossover. We talked about striving to get your partner to heaven, and we also talked about holding fast to your spouse, as it talks about in Ephesians 5:31. Remember that it is important that we engage in all of these things as mature Christians. Yes, we will grow as we get deeper into any relationship, but we need to be as mature as possible when engaging in this. And it's important that, to bring up something that Brian talked about last week, that we are so entwined with one another, so focused on one another, that it's natural to express the kind of love that a husband should for their wife, that a wife should for their husband. That we should be so engaged with that process day to day that it's like muscle memory, so to speak. That it comes easy, and not that it's easy, but it comes much easier than if you're not practiced at it. So today, we're going to start with, so that we're still kind of focusing on husbands, but a lot of this applies to wives as well. Keep your physical attention on your spouse. So we'll go to a few places here as we consider this. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We've been dipping into 1 Corinthians 7 off and on here. And some of this conversation does go to another comment that was made in terms of we are still supposed to remain as separate individuals as we engage in this. You can't become your spouse. You can't cut yourself off from your spouse as you have disagreements. It's a working together. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting at the very start of the chapter, verses 1 through 6, it says this. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now as a concession, not a command, I say this. And I wanted to end with that piece there because, again, this is advice that he's giving, not a command, but it's still the principle of keeping our physical attention on our spouse. And I think that bears out also over in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and this should sound familiar to you. It's a place where people go somewhat regularly. Not as often maybe when we're talking about marriage and the ideal of what a marriage should look like, but Matthew 5, starting in verse 27 and going through 30, it says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. Everyone. Who's included in everyone? Everyone? Yeah, is there anyone that's kept out of that thought, right? So that would include married people as well, correct? And over in Ephesians 5:31, we talked about this some yesterday in terms of holding fast to your partner, but again, there's application here in terms of this physical attention that we have. Ephesians 5 and verse 31, as a reminder, it says this: "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Ultimately, you're going to have problems if you can't keep your physical attention, your physical focus on your spouse, on your partner, right? It's going. You think about the things that lead to divorce. That's pretty high up there, right? So, husbands, wives, I'll say this as well, but what can we do to make sure that we keep our focus where it should be? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Avoid distractions and noise. Can you expound on that a little? Okay, so make choices that nobody else. There are a lot of things that we might be witness to out in the world that trying to, we think of, as it talks about in James, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their troubles, and to keep oneself unspotted from the world, right? Trying to keep our focus where it should be, avoiding those things that we should. Yes, sir. Absolutely. It's one of those things, kind of as we talked about with love, that there's this constant practice, right? This exercise of self-control in which we should be engaging. Self-control doesn't come very naturally, Raising a child, I've noticed that self-control isn't always the first thing that comes to mind, but it's something that gets practiced. It's something that we should be so engaged in consistently that, again, it's natural to us. Roger, did you have something and then? Yeah, well, and from a human standpoint, yes, there are deep divers, but eventually they got to come up for air, right? Having those restrictions, and you can't come up too quickly, or you end up causing yourself some serious problems. Yeah, in helping us, back to Colleen's point, is that if we restrict what influences and impacts us, that we'll have more freedom to exercise the way that we should. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to what they have said here behind me, the world teaches our young people and it teaches all of us that it's not possible to control your passion. You must act on it because it's stronger than you and it's more powerful than you. So you cannot control it, and that's a lie. That is a
So I'm going to address self-control again here, but in this regard. So this passage often gets taken out of context, so I'm going to go back further into the text. Philippians 4, starting in verse 10. Well, that's a good place to start. Philippians 4, starting in verse 10. I rejoiced in the Lord greatly that now at length you've revived your concern for me. You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. Not that I am speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low. I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And again, in terms of attention in that regard, our self-control, our ability to control ourselves, we receive strength from the Lord to be able to make it through whatever we're facing. He has given us the ability to be content in all circumstances. And I think contentment goes a long way to self-control. Right? If I'm able to be content, it's much easier to be in control of myself. Absolutely. Any other thoughts here? Yes, sir. And then... We forget to keep ourselves disciplined and under control, forgetting that we are children of God and he disciplines those whom he loves, right? That we forget that we need to keep ourselves under control, as the case may be. Yes, sir? And then if there's any other. Yes, it is helpful to have that as you're growing up, but again, somewhat to Jerry's point, I think from last week, in that terms of maturity, as we enter into the body of the Lord, that growth that we should be experiencing, we can't remain as newborn babes. We've got to continue to work and engage. So yes, there's a blessing if we have it from a child, but there's also no excuse for us if we didn't have that growing up. It's so important that we are engaged in this, that we continue to go back to the Word for all of this. Now, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one here, so that we can keep going a little bit. 1 Peter 3:7. There are two that fall here, but we'll kind of address them a little separately. 1 Peter 3:7. It says, likewise, so going back to this comparison between Sarah and Abraham, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you and of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Now, this was a passage that was brought up within the last week or maybe the week prior, about the prayers not being hindered. But what does it mean to live with your wives in an understanding way? I've taught long enough, I'm comfortable with silences. Somewhat to, Bill, your comment from last week as well, in terms of the three reactions that people tend to have with disagreements with their spouse, either cutting them off, becoming the same person as them, or kind of retaining that unique identity, is that it's important that as we retain who we are within a relationship, that part of that is you cannot help your spouse if you become your spouse or if you cut them off. You have to understand their weaknesses, because that's the only way to also, going back a little bit into something one of the previous topics about striving to get your partner to heaven. You cannot help your partner get to heaven if you don't understand their weaknesses, if you don't understand what they may struggle with. You can't help them if you're not going to be able to support them through the times that they're going to have troubles, the times that they're going to have struggles in various ways. Any other thoughts on this understanding? Yes, sir. And this is another one I'm going to connect back to practicing a lot. Understanding how your spouse reacts to things, how your spouse handles things, the way that your spouse thinks. You will never think exactly as they do, but the better that you can work to understand your spouse, the better you'll be able to help them through this life. And again, it's through practice. None of these things that we're talking about are things that if you let yourself get away from doing it for a little bit are going to be easy to get back to. All of these things are things that require us to be constantly engaged with it, to be focused on it, to be not letting ourselves get out of the habit. It's got to be so firmly ingrained again that it's nature to us, as though we are taking care of ourselves, as taking care of our own bodies. These things need to be practiced for us. I'm going to go ahead and move to honor. What does honor mean? Showing honor to your wife. Husbands, what does it mean to show honor to your wife? Okay? Do you want to go ahead and I can read that, or you can if you'd like? And well, and I would extend that maybe even into 9 here. It's do not repay evil for evil or reviling for reviling, but on the contrary, bless, for this you were called, that you may obtain a blessing. This thought of if we have the right focus, if we have the humility that Christ had in regards to his sacrifice, right? We've made that comparison because it says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. If we have the right mind, if we're humble, if we're tender, if we have sympathy with them, if we are focused on, oh, well, I didn't get my way, so now you're not going to get your way. If we're focused on doing what we should do in a lot of ways, that ends up showing honor. That thought of striving to outdo one another, right? Any other thoughts on this? Yes, sir. Yeah, that thought of being, of marriage being that bond. Uh, Not to say that being married to my wife is a heavy burden, is a yoke placed upon me, but you're right, that being bound together, working toward what should be the same goal. And if two oxes are walking side by side, if one ox kicks the other one down, what benefit is that to the one, right? They're going to struggle more. You're going to have more problems if you're kicking out the one who's supposed to be supporting you. Yes, sir.
I think we need to think about his language here, because he says likewise. It goes back, all the way back to verse, the beginning of the chapter. There's a mutual thing going on here. It's not just the husbands, it's the wives as well. And he's talking about some that don't obey the word. So the wives need to be careful that they're obeying the word and doing what God has asked them to do in subjection to the husband. But if that falls short, the husband has to say, hey, you're the weaker vessel. I need to give you that honor, give you that respect, and allow you to mature. And we can't just throw it all on the husband, because it's a mutual thing. When you read these verses in context, that's not full amount, right? It's not just husbands, it's wives as well. So those all go together. But likewise goes back to what he said about the wives, giving honor to the husband, and the husband giving honor to the wife. But she may be a weak vessel because she may not obey the word. So I want to make sure we're clear about that language.
Oh yeah, and we'll get there. I have those verses listed out. I'm just focusing on husbands first, and because I'm a little selfish and need to hear some of this myself. That, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this context of, again, back to the not to call anyone an ox necessarily, but it works both ways, right? If one ox kicks the other and hurts it, and then that second ox kicks back, right? It's mutually destructive to have a relationship where you're constantly at odds with your spouse, that you're not focused on, oh, you're helping me to pull this load as well, and that gratitude, again, the gratitude that we should have, the humility that we should have. Ma'am, and then sir. And then yes. So, and I'll come back. Okay. And I think that's one of the important things about this, the thought of striving to get your partner to heaven is you should have ultimately the goal to be working to get one another there. Sir, and then I've got you on my... But again, if you look throughout Scripture, we have several examples of those who did well and those who did poorly at all aspects of this. And to what Jerry's saying is, when it works well, it's both sides working together. Sir. Yeah, we get focused sometimes on that instant gratification in terms of, hey, I put in this effort, right? I should see the benefit of it. But getting to heaven is not that way, right? We have this hope, this expectation of what is to come, and I understand it's important that even if your spouse does not believe, if your spouse in this case was a pagan, that you continue to do what you should do so that your children may be impacted, so that your spouse may be impacted. One of the things I am very thankful for, my wife's mother made sure that she and her sister were at services every single Sunday, regardless of the poor connection with their father. He was not a great impact, not a great influence. But I'm thankful for what her mother continued to do to make sure that her children were taken care of. And ultimately, it didn't have the desired impact on her husband, but she continued doing what she was supposed to be doing. And again, that's our focus, is you may never end up winning them, but your hope is that through your action, you might have an impact on them. Yes. Yes. And again, that's back to this, both sides. One spouse can continue to do what they're supposed to do and have an impact. But from an ideal standpoint, it's so much better when both of us are working together to hit that goal. When both of us are focused on striving together it's not that it can't be done. I know of several cases even here where a spouse has had an impact on an unbelieving spouse. But this striving together, this working together, this focus on one another. Again, I think that back to where we started today, keeping your physical attention on your spouse, all of these things kind of are pieces to a puzzle to get all of us where we need to be, and ultimately that's heaven, right? Our goal needs to be focused on, I'm going to get my wife to heaven as best as I possibly can, even if I have to drag her there. And hopefully she's doing the same, so that we're both really shoving forward to make sure we are as in a good spot as possible to spend eternity where we should. And those around us, as we have these conversations with people, as we have conversations with our children and all of that. Yes, sir. Hmm? I've talked about fairness some, and this desire for fairness, and it's not. I think it was mentioned last week that it's not a 50-50. It's supposed to be 100% engagement on both parts to be able to help us do what we need to do to overcome any evil, hopefully in our spouse, and have it overcome in us by the goodness of our spouse. I'm going to keep moving forward here because I need to get to wives as well. So I'm going to bring one up here, one last one for husbands, and some of this, again, there's a lot of crossover between how husbands, surprise, surprise, how husbands and wives should treat one another. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8. Again, I think this can apply to both, but But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And I want to bring out, it's not just physical providence, but making sure that we're engaged emotionally and spiritually with our family. Because you have not fully provided for your family if they are not taken care of in the ways that matter toward eternity. So it's important that we have that emphasis on there as well. Let's talk some about wives. Let's go to Titus 2. Multiple of these come from there. I'm going to read Titus 2, verses 4 and 5, because this is kind of sandwiched by this talk about husbands, so I think it's applicable here toward wives. So Titus 2, 4 and 5, and so train young women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled, pure, working at home, kind, and submissive to their husbands, that the word of God may not be reviled. So we've talked a lot about loving one another, so husbands and wives. We've talked about being self-controlled from both the husband's aspect and from the wife's aspect. We've touched some on purity in other aspects here. I'm going to get to what does it mean to work at home? Okay. What other thoughts on that? What does it mean to work at home? Yes. So being connected to your family, being connected to what goes on there. Any other thoughts as to work at home? Yeah.
Keepers at home, managers of their households, working at home, busy at home. So definitely they're active and also somewhat leadership to make sure things don't get missed. I guess there's a big strain in today's culture that you have to have two working parents. And I can't explain all of how to solve everything, but personally, we've had to do a hybrid. It worked some years, and then things change. You can be off during the critical years, or have someone come in home at some point. My wife was working at home and had somebody come in and watch the kids at the same home. Well, that's still managing, and she was definitely busy working at the same time, but making sure things were balanced. And it's tough to know, but there's some sacrifices made to get there too. And I think that's that whole language is that there's some ownership and there's some, she's not watching Judge Judy all day long marathons, that because things will drop. That's her. Same thing with the guy. He can't just say, "Oh, I've got a work trip," and put everything on her, or that he's gone off with his buddies to do whatever when there's a shared responsibility. So it's an active role, and there is a household tie with the woman.
And I want to call out two things in my thoughts as you're talking here as well. We just talked about providing for your family. I think that's connected to that as well. It's a form of providing for your family. That's part of why I said it's not limited to just husbands to providing for the family. And I'm also a little surprised, I guess, that no one brought up the Proverbs 31 woman in the discussion as of yet, right? She did a lot of work, right? There was a lot that she engaged in that you might not necessarily think of when you think of work from home, but there was ownership. To use one of the things that you pulled out was there's ownership of helping in that relationship and taking care of things in providing. And again, the husband can't just leave because that's neglecting the emotional and the spiritual needs of the family as well. It's that, to Jerry's point, this cross-functional providing for one another, to be so focused on one another that you're not going to have some of those struggles. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, and it doesn't say just work at home, but it indicates that that's part of that connection, right? Again, to the ownership of that, right? So it's both husbands and wives need to be so focused on the needs of their partner, on getting them to heaven, that it's second nature. It's so natural that we have ownership of helping our spouse in every way possible. It also, in my translation, to again bring out that we have differing translations out there, be kind. Again, we've brought that up some, and I think it's important to bring up that it says be kind. Then, of course, the one somewhat to Jerry's point as well, Titus 2:5 says to be submissive and submissive to their own husbands. It also mentions submission in Colossians 3:18. Over in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and Ephesians 5:22 through 24. So since we spent more time on that passage, I'm going to go back to 1 Peter chapter 3. Verses 1 through 6 here it says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. When they see your respectful and pure conduct, do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious. For this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you are her children, if you do good and do not fear anything that is frightening." Again, and we've talked about it some, but I'll have your comment here just a moment. I want to read in connection to that the passage in Ephesians 5:22 through 24. 22 through 24, it says, "Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands." You had a...
I was going to tie into that, so I'm bringing
Sure.
the onus back to the husband, right?
Yeah.
Because if the husband loves the wife, like Jesus says, to love the wife, like I have loved you, and give my life for you, it's a lot easier for the woman to do exactly what those verses say. If the husband's a jerk and self-conceited and all about himself, that's all going to fall apart. So, again, I don't want to
Yep.
sit on one side.
Nope.
It starts with us to love our wives, right? And I've made many mistakes not doing that, but when I do that, I can see a difference. I can see a reaction that is biblical to say, yes, I can follow those verses, but when I'm being a jerk and I'm being self-conceited, then a lot of things fall apart very easily.
Again, to tie a couple of passages together, if you want to lead your family as Christ leads the church, you should also love them as Christ loved the church, right? If you have that expectation, that thought. Again, to those who aren't married, it's so important that when you are if you work to find someone, as you look at the potential for someone to be a partner for the future, both sides, is this someone that you think that you can love as Christ loved the church? And is this someone that you feel as though you can submit to, right? You have to understand getting into that relationship what the expectation is, or you're setting yourself up for failure, right? That's why I think it's important that we talk about these things, is that it helps us to hopefully grow as Christians, and I need to be as strict on myself as possible. And it's important that each one of us strive to be the best possible. I know we're technically out of time, so I'm going to bring up two things. 1 Peter 3 and 4 mentions a couple of things, but I'm going to bring up, it's be focused on inward qualities over outward beauty. Again, that was the example that Sarah said, that those women had adorned themselves with in the past, was these inward qualities more so than the outward beauty. And then, 1 Corinthians 11, 5 through 16 talks about head coverings, but we don't have too much time to get into that. I'm just going to read a couple of things that I have pulling out of a commentary. I don't always agree with this commentator, but I think the way they put it was well. The shaving of any woman's head was considered either a sign of deep mourning or a fitting punishment for adultery, and the overwhelming inference here is not that the Corinthian women had thrown off the Oriental-style veil that obscured almost all of the female person, there being no evidence at all that first-century Christian women ever wore such a thing, but that they had adopted the chic hairstyles of the women of Aphrodite. The sin was not in cutting off hair, but in cutting it off in such a manner as to obscure the sexes or to imitate the shameless prostitutes of the pagan temples. Again, this thought about inward over outward is that there was this imitation of sinful people, sinful practices, so as there could be, I think, Brian, you addressed it in a sermon recently, that there's no differentiation between people in the world and people in Christ. It does end in verse 16, and I'm going to call that out as well, by saying, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. Again, there's some cultural tie-ins here. There's some importance in the context of the time. Remembering, and I bring this passage up because it does talk about wives in there, but that it's this imitation of worldly people, this imitation of people who were, I mean, if you don't know about again, it says the shameless prostitutes of the pagan temples, making yourself go out and look like a prostitute. Again, there's that differentiation between a focus on inward qualities over outward beauty. And that's kind of how that ties in. If you want to talk more about that, I'm happy to, but we have run out of time. Thank you all for your comments, and Brian will be